You are more likely to know Steve Dolinsky as NBC5's food guy. And during his 17 years on ABC7 as the Hungry Hound. This guy has the job us foodies dream about. But it's more than that. Steve is an award-winning author. I know some of us have his books and can have them today too, because he's going to have them available for us. Steve is also the producer and host of Pizza City, a podcast where he features some of the greatest pizza makers in the nation. But Steve does lots more. So, what brings Steve here today? Well, frankly, in part, it's his father-in-law, Alan Dordak. And Alan, you can raise your hand. There you see Alan. Those of you on Zoom won't see him. But Alan is an active Tuesday Club member, a regular participant to my Zoom current events discussion, and he's Steve's father-in-law. But mostly, Steve loves to talk about food, of which he is an expert, and especially pizza. But you need to know that Steve does much more related to food, teaching, training, judging, volunteering his time and talents to important Chicago area charitable organizations that focus on hunger relief. There's even more, but we only have an hour. This is one civic-minded, very active guy. Maybe that's how he can eat so much and still stay slim. I will stop here. Genetically, my Sicilian genes are kicking in, and I'm getting hungry just talking about this stuff. So let's give a warm, crusty, melted mozzarella welcome to a serious food expert who has won 13 James Beard Awards for his TV, radio, and podcast work. Mr. Food Guy, the Hungry Hound, and Alan Dordak's son-in-law, Steve Dolinsky. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. You guys can hear me okay? Hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. And I do feel incumbent upon myself to make an addendum to the Gulf report. Very important news about a week ago. For those of you who don't know, I'm Al Dordak's son-in-law. I don't know if that was mentioned previously. Al Dordak, sitting among us, had a hole-in-one last week, right? Which hole was it and where was it?
Number 6 at Chevy Chase.
Number 6 at Chevy Chase. So there should be a plaque right at the T there. Al Dordak, hole-in-one last week. Congratulations. That's a huge accomplishment. Okay. So as you were hearing earlier, I have a thing about food. I've been eating food professionally for about 27 years here in Chicago. Started in 1995 as the host and producer of a show called Good Eating, which was on CLTV, the belatedly now canceled CLTV, Chicagoland Television. And my background is really as a news reporter, and that's kind of where I get my broadcast chops. So I went to University of Wisconsin, studied broadcasting, had a job in Upper Michigan for a year, had a couple jobs in the Quad Cities, Davenport, Iowa, Rock Island, Illinois. And then I came to Chicago almost exactly 30 years ago. I moved here in October of 92. So I consider myself a Chicagoan. I'm originally from Minneapolis. And when I moved here, I was doing news reporting. There was no such thing as a food reporter. We had at the time critics at both major dailies, at the Chicago Magazine, and that was about it, and the Chicago Reader. And so I just fell in love with the food scene in Chicago right away. I knew there was more than Italian beef and pizza and hot dogs here, obviously. And I always tried to kind of weasel my way into stories that dealt with food, even though that wasn't really my beat, covering news. But lo and behold, right place, right time, 95, they launched a food show called Good Eating. And I raised my hand and I said, I want to work on the food show because I love eating so much. And that was really my MBA in food. I never went to culinary school. but I learned everything I could about asking questions and reading and, reading MFK Fisher and reading Gourmet Magazine and reading whatever I could about food to learn more, because I knew that I was always having this imposter syndrome. Who was I to tell people about food when I didn't have a career in a kitchen. So did that show we did 52 shows a year for 8 years. And then in 2003, they canceled the show and I shot myself around Chicago as a food reporter. And that title had never really existed on television. And so I was trying to convince people and news directors and general managers in Chicago that, hey, food is important. People care about food, where they're going to eat, where they're going to spend their money, what they're going to do this weekend, just as much as they care about news, traffic, weather, sports, health, etc. So I managed to convince the news director at ABC7 that we would do a food segment. And again, right place, right time. They were canceling a soap opera, and all of a sudden they had an hour to fill at 11 a.m. every day. And so they added this segment and we called it the Hungry Hound. And that lasted for 17 years. At one point I was doing 4 stories a week. And so that show, and then during COVID, they decided not to do food anymore. And so I was kind of adrift for a few months, got my real estate broker's license. If anybody needs a condominium here, talk to me after the segment. And then NBC called. They have a new general manager. This was about a year ago. They're very interested in food coverage and they reached out to me. And so long story short, I've now been in NBC for about a year. The segment is called The Food Guy. I'm on every Thursday night at 10 p.m. But let's go back 5 years. 5 years ago, I was reading a listicle, which is basically a list/article about the 7 hottest pizza places in Chicago. And I looked at this list and I thought, well, I've got lots of issues with the places they're picking. And has the reporter even been to these places? And I've already been to several of these and I disagree. And so I kind of decided right then and there in 2017 to just get to the bottom of it once and for all. I mean, I lived in Chicago for 25 years at that point. Has anybody ever done a deep dive on pizza? I knew the late food critic at the Sun-Times, Pat Bruno, had written a book about pizza, which is mostly recipes. I knew the editors at Chicago Magazine had written a book called Everybody Loves Pizza, which was kind of a historical look, but wasn't really the deep dive I was looking for. And so I just decided, well, let's do it. So what's it going to take? It's going to take, mapping out the region. It's going to take ordering the same thing every time, half sausage, half pepperoni. It's going to take meticulous notes. It's going to take a lot of stomach space. I decided that I would do, there's a company called Core Power Yoga. I exercise almost every day now. And I do this class, which is really intensive to maintain my weight because I'm going to be eating one day. I'm going to be exercising the next day. So a lot of exercise, a lot of, which I didn't realize, a lot of acid reflux medicine, a lot of, what's it called? Prilosec or? Yes. This is the audience to ask for medical information. I know that. And so a lot of acid reflux because of the tomatoes, right? And then I just decided to set out like Sherman, kind of moving through the South. Like today I'm going to go to Naperville and then Glen Ellen and then Wheaton and then, and so on. Or I'm going to go north to Skokie and then Deerfield and then Highland Park. And I would just check off as much as I could. And I would do about 3 or 4 places a day. I wouldn't eat a whole pizza, obviously. I'm taking one slice, one bite from the tip, one bite from the heel, and trying to assess. And essentially, it's really all about the crust, I think. Every pizza, it's based on a great crust or not a great crust. And so after about 4 months of eating, I went to about 80 places. I realized that there was a story here because people were chiming in on my website like, I live in Arizona now. I grew up in Chicago. I miss such and such. I miss such and such. And so I pitched this idea to Northwestern University Press, and they said, this is a great idea for a book. Let's do a book. Of those 80 places, though, only about 40 or 50 were really recommendable. Because on average, if you go to 3 or 4 pizza places in a day, one is going to be great. And so I needed to go to another 100 or so. So I ended up going to 186 places over 6 months. And came up with 101. That was my first book, Pizza City USA, that came out 4 or 5 years ago. And then as we started a pizza tour business that year, because I felt like there was only one business in town, wasn't really doing the greatest job. And so I want to create my own pizza tour business called Pizza City Tours. And we do 4 tours every weekend now through the summer. And then I decided to launch a podcast called Pizza City, where I talk to the greatest pizza makers in the world every other Friday. And then I decided we should do a festival. So we just did a festival 2 weeks ago called Pizza City Fest. It's going to become the Taste of Chicago for pizza. That's going to be every year now. And we had 40 pizza makers over 2 days. And what I kept deciding and kept realizing was Chicago was more than a one-trick pony. It was more than stuffed or deep or tavern style. It was this panoply of many, many styles here. People come to Chicago to make their way, whether it's architecture or art or culture or music or food. And pizza is one of those expressions. And so I realized that we've got 10 styles of pizza, which I'll talk about briefly. And we've got more than the stuffed pie that typically gets mocked on the East Coast by New Yorkers. And so during the pandemic, when everything was shut down, I realized a lot of chefs were pivoting to pizza because it checks all the boxes, right? It's affordable. You can feed multiple people. You can satisfy your meat lover, your cheese lover, your vegetarian, your vegan, your gluten-free, everything. Pizza checks all those boxes. It's also so familiar. And there's a term that I have in my first book called PIGUE syndrome, PIGUE syndrome, which stands for pizza I grew up eating, which if you're from the North Shore, I know you love Barnaby's or Lou's. If you're from the South Side, Homewood Flossmoor, I know you're an Aurelio's person. If you're from the West Side, Elmwood Park, I know you're an Armand's person, and on it goes. If you're from Bridgeport, I know you like Phil's. If you're from Oakland, I know you like Phil's. If you're from Hedgewish, I know you like Pudgy's. So it's all about where you grew up eating, right? The best pizza in the world, it's one of 4 places. It's either where you grew up, where you work, where your kids go to school, where you live. So that's kind of the best pizza for Chicagoans. The other term I came up with is OBR, optimal bite ratio. So when you eat a great sandwich or a great taco or a great slice of pizza, what is it that's memorable? It is the balance. It's not that I ate a pound of cheese. It's that, boy, every bite I had a little bit of crust, a little bit of cheese, a little bit of sauce, a little bit of topping. That's kind of my sweet spot, right? The OBR, optimal bite ratio. And so when I get a stuffed pie that is just 8 pounds of cheese or a ton of dough on the outside, that to me doesn't satisfy my OBR rating. And so during the pandemic, I pitched the second book to Northwestern University Press, and they said, sure enough, let's do this. So we came out with the Ultimate Chicago Pizza Guide, which JD is here today, and I'm going to be signing and selling books after this. That is really my magnum opus. That is really my love letter to Chicago. It's really, if you're coming to Chicago for 3 or 4 days, where do I need to eat pizza, Steve? With a chapter and a big nod to the suburbs, some of the suburban icons, but it's mostly about if I'm going to be in Chicago City proper, where do I need to eat pizza? And believe it or not, there's 100 plus places to go, divided into 10 styles of pizza. So I want to talk a little bit about this today. Let's see if this works here. Yep, there we go. You can all see that. I'm assuming the Zoom folks can see this. You're okay, great, thanks. Okay, so what is Chicago style pizza? Well, let's talk about, there's 3 waves of pizza really that I discuss in the book, the 1940s, the 1970s, and the 2010s. 1940s was really tavern style, and we'll talk about that in a second. The thin and crispy sauce and cheese, edge to edge, places like Home Run Inn on the South Side, Barnaby's on the North Shore, places that were bars typically or taverns first and became pizzerias later, like Home Run Inn was a tavern in the 20s and 30s, but became a pizzeria when the son-in-law came back from the war, went into business with his mother-in-law, Mary Grittani, and they started a pizzeria in 47. And they just celebrated 75 years. 1970s was really where we saw the deep dish wave happen in a big way. 1971 was really kind of the seminal year for that. And then you saw a lot of imitators and people saying, well, we've got thin, but we've got a lot of people coming and asking for deep dish now because that word is getting around. And so we should add deep dish to our menus. It's also the birth of the pizza puff. Anybody know what a pizza puff is? No? Yeah, a couple shaking your head. That was essentially an answer from the hot dog joints who were getting crushed by the pizzerias opening in the 70s. And there's a company a block from my house in Westtown called Il Taco, which stands for Illinois Tamale Company. started by Assyrian Christian immigrants in the 1920s. And they were making tamales, and the hot dog places were asking the tamale company, hey, could you give us something that's sort of pizza related so we can compete with all these pizzerias that are popping up in the 1970s? And they created a pizza puff, which is basically a tortilla filled with pizza ingredients that you can drop in a deep fryer, because they all have deep fryers for their French fries. And they created this fried pizza puff, which is now available in 45 states in America, but started right here in Chicago. And then the 20-teens is where you see more of an artisan approach, more chefs who've got culinary school experience and background and training, taking that bread baking experience to pizza and creating really delicious, remarkable crusts that did not exist in Chicago until the 20-teens. And so those are the three waves of pizza. Tavern, deep, and stuffed are, when someone asks me, what is Chicago style pizza, Steve? I always say, well, I've got to qualify that. It's tavern or it's deep or it's stuffed, kind of depending on where you're from and when you moved to Chicago or when you grew up here. Because some people will say, it's a Giordano's town. That didn't start till 74 in Marquette Park. Some will say it's Lou Malnati's town. That didn't start till 71 in Lincolnwood. Some will say it's a Home Run Inn / Vito and Nick / Barnaby's town. Those are tavern styles that started in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So those are the three Chicago styles. And then I think there are 10 styles of pizza in the second city. So that's kind of my thesis. So the first wave, boys coming back from the war, we had existing taverns officially adding pizzas to their menu. You can see there's a picture of Home Run Inn from the 1940s. It really was a tavern. These are all Home Run Inn pictures, by the way. Anybody been to Home Run Inn? Okay. So first let's raise a hand. How many have had Home Run Inn frozen pizza? Okay. And then how many of those have been to the actual Home Run Inn store? Only, okay, a couple of you, great. I highly recommend a trip to the Mothership. It's on 31st Street in the shadow of Comiskey. I'm not going to call it Guaranteed Rate because I still call it Comiskey. It's a very South Side icon. They're all over the sort of the South and Southwest suburbs now. They got about 8 or 9 locations. People swear by the frozen pizza, and that's typically what I recommend if you want a frozen pizza. I still think they do a good job because they've got a huge USDA approved facility down there. But I really like going to the Mothership every now and then. Actually, the first time I went there was with my brother-in-law, Andrew Dordek, and his wife and daughter. And I was really skeptical because I'm like, this is a frozen pizza, but actually is a really good pizza. It's got a little bit of malt in it. It's got a little sweetness to it. It's got a slightly crimped edge. You see they serve it on a dimpled pan, and that elevates the pizza a little bit. And that is key to me because it allows airflow underneath the pizza. So unlike when you have a pizza 15, 20 minutes after sitting on cardboard, which is going to be steamed and soggy, this retains its crispness. So right there, I think that's a kind of an important point. And then you see on the left side, far left side, if you can sort of squint, that's Mary Grittani in the middle, the matriarch. And she, because her husband passed away, she was really the owner of female-owned business in 1940s, kind of rare. And then her son-in-law came back from the war, and they went into business to created a pizzeria. Because what was happening was people would go to these taverns. They used to give you popcorn. If everybody remembers this. But that quickly became pizza because these little makeshift ovens that you could either be electric or gas fired, depending on where you lived. They could make these thin pizzas. They cut them into squares. They pass it around the bar. They could put a little square on a cocktail napkin. And that was kind of a bonus. And that what it really was strategy to get you to drink more beer because it was salty. And the current president and CEO of Home Run Inn told me that he remembers it as a kid. The pizza tasted pretty salty to him. And that makes sense because the bartenders wanted you to get thirsty. So they would make a salty pizza. But that's where it kind of started. And then people would come in eventually and say, hey, just give me a whole pie. I'm going to take it home. Because traditionally in Chicago, you'd stop at the neighborhood tavern, have a couple squares, have a couple beers, and then go home and have dinner with your family. But eventually that morphed into let's take a pizza home to the family. And that's how Chicagoans grew up with this memory of growing up around square cut, thin pizzas that were brought home. It just evolved into the main course. So then we've got in the 1940s another story. And there are just so many stories about pizza in Chicago. This is kind of my reporter passion that I kind of dug into in the second book, was telling these stories. And so there's lots of players here with the Uno's story. I'm going to try to keep it short just because we've got limited amount of time here, but essentially, there was this building here at the corner of Ohio and Wabash. It was called the Pelican Club in the early 1940s. By the way, anybody remember this? Because I know we've got a gentleman who's 91, so you might remember this place. But this was in 1942 as the Pelican Club. They had 2 pizzas on their menu. They had a sausage and cheese or an anchovy and sauce. Those are the 2 pizzas you could get. And now remember, at this time in Chicago, most of the pizzerias were down on Taylor Street, coal-fired, wood-fired, Neapolitan style. Gas-fired was just coming on the scene. Gas-fired pizza allows you to control the temperature. When it's coal or wood, it's going to be a high heat bake. So it's a very quick bake, like a Neapolitan pizza. But as technology evolves and you get a gas-fired oven, it allows you to bring the temperature to control the temperature, 500, 600, 700 Fahrenheit. So anyway, the Pelican Club goes away. There's a guy named Rick Ricardo. There's a picture of Rick on the far right side. Looks a little bit like Salvador Dali. Rick Ricardo and his family live upstairs in this building. And there's downstairs is a vacant space that he opens it up, calls it the pizzeria. It was named Ricardo's. It was named the pizzeria. And they're doing this pizza that's baked in a pan that they inherited from the Pelican Club. Not as high as a typical deep or stuffed pizza. It's a little bit lower, maybe 1.5 inches high. But they're baking these pies in these baking these pizzas in these pans. And the problem in the 1943, when he opened, was you could not get alcohol because it was World War II and everything was tough to find, kind of like now, the supply chains, right? And so he makes a deal, basically a devil's bargain, with a guy named Ike Sewell, pictured here with the red tie, Texas native, played football, University of Texas, not really a food guy. He's a liquor guy. He works for Fleischmann's Liquors. And he makes a deal with Rick Ricardo, and he says, I'm going to sell you all the liquor you need. In exchange, you're going to put my wife on the deed to the business. So I get half the business. But he doesn't want to attract attention because if you're in the liquor business, you can't also own a bar. So the co-owner of this business in 1943 is Florence Davis. And Davis was her maiden name, because if they put Sewell on the deed, that would attract attention. And so Florence Davis is on the deed of the business. Rick Ricardo is getting his alcohol delivered regularly. And just at the same time, there's a guy named Adolfo Malnati working in the bar. Eventually, his son, Lou Malnati, is working there as well. There's a picture of both of them on the left side here. Adolfo is seated and Lou Malnati is standing. And Lou becomes the manager of the business because his father gets hit by a car and he's injured, and so he can't really work as well. So Lou Malnati is basically running this business day to day. Sadly, Rick Ricardo passes away in 1954, a heart attack, and immediately the business reverts to Ike Sewell's wife, Florence Davis. And so a year later, they open up Pizzeria Due down the block, 1955. And when they open up Due, they decide we should change the name of the pizzeria to Pizzeria Uno, since that was the first place we had. So in 1955, suddenly we have Pizzeria Uno and Pizzeria Due, both being managed and run by Lou Malnati. And eventually, I talked about the story there. And so eventually, Lou goes to Ike Sewell and asks for equity, asks for ownership, asks for a succession plan. Like, Mr. Sewell, I know you're the owner and you're only really here coming in to drink with your friends, and I'm running the business every day, but I want to talk about ownership. And Ike Sewell says, I'm not going to sell to you, Lou. And he ends up selling it, by the way, several years later to a Boston-based Kentucky Fried Chicken franchisee. Fun fact, Pizzeria Uno, Pizzeria Due have not been owned by a Chicagoan since the late 80s. So it's a Boston-based corporation. In Chicago, it's called Pizzeria Uno, but outside of Chicago, it's referred to as Uno Chicago Pizza and Grill. So it's not really, doesn't really have a Chicago presence anymore. Of course, Lou Malnati quits immediately because there's no future for him at this business, takes a year off, and 14 months later, he opens up on St. Patrick's Day in 1971 in Lincolnwood, Lou Malnati's. And again, you remember North Shore, 1971, there was not a lot of deep dish pizza. And what had happened between 1943 and 1971 was there was a cook named Alice Mae Redmond. And she is crucial to the story of deep dish, by the way. She's from Mississippi. She gets poached by the 3 cab drivers opening up a place called Gino's East in 1966. They know nothing about pizza, so they're smart and they poach one of the cooks from Uno's and Due's. And Alice May Redmond cannot get the dough to press out into the pan fast enough to meet demand, because suddenly there's this gold rush. And so she thinks of her childhood in Mississippi. She makes it's called a biscuit, sort of a short dough recipe with lots of fat in it to get the dough the gluten to relax in the pan. And so rather than using bacon fat, she's using oil. And so all of a sudden in the late 60s, early 70s, you see more pizzerias adding oil to their dough to get it to proof out into the pans faster. And this is where you see the height rise slightly, the thickness, the heaviness of the pizza rise slightly. Because in the 1940s, I've seen pictures of the original, sort of the old school deep dish pizza that we saw at Uno's and Due's. It was not this big. It was quite small. It had a kind of a high crust on the outside, but it was 5/8 of an inch in the middle. And you could pick it up. It was firm enough to hold with your hands. You didn't need knife and fork. So this is what sort of happens as the evolution of deep dish continues. Okay, so did I finish that story about Lou? Real fun fact also about Lou Malnati. So Adolfo, the old man, seated here, that was on the 10th anniversary, by the way, of Uno, so 1953. So Adolfo gets remarried years later, and with his second wife, they have a son named Rudy Jr., and so Rudy Jr. is Lou's half brother, right? Rudy Jr. in 1991 opens a place called Paisanos. Anybody, you've been to Paisanos? Similar deep dish, looks a lot like a Lou Malnati's pizza. There was also a woman who was a waitress in the 1950s at Due's named Louise De Janeiro, and she was good friends with the Malnatis. She quit in 1980 and she opened a place in Crestwood, south suburbs, called Luisa's Pizza and Pasta. Again, very similar looking pizza to Lou Malnati's. So what happens because of this is that you get this sort of deep dish ecosystem in Chicago. It's one of the reasons why there is no other city in America that has this depth and this breadth, because these folks stayed in Chicago. They're used to using the Chicago metallic pans. They're used to the Blodgett ovens. They're used to the ingredients here. And so they take their expertise and they move around to Gino's East and to Luisa's and to Lou's and to Paisanos. And so you get this sort of deep dish ecosystem. And here's the architecture. This is from Bartoli's, another great place in Roscoe Village and in Ukrainian Village. He's the grandson of Fred Bartoli, one of the founders of Gino's East. And you see there's a bottom crust that's pressed up high along the sides, and then slices of mozzarella to protect the bottom crust from the sauce, because sauce is kind of the enemy. It makes it a little bit gummy. And then your topping, and in Chicago, it is typically raw Italian sausage that's pinched and pressed. So pinch and press is the technique. Unless you go to Lou Malnati's and you get a sausage and it's one sort of patty of sausage, unless you specify crumbled, which I highly recommend to get OBR. And then your sauce on top of the sausage, and then a little bit of pecorino romano, and then baked. So that's typically 30 to 40 minutes, sometimes dried oregano also to finish a pizza. Second wave is the 1970s. So a picture on the left is Pequod's, picture on the right is my pie, I think. Yeah, it's my pie. So in 1971, I mentioned Lou Malnati opens up on St. Patrick's Day. By the way, for those of you who don't know, there was a huge line at Lou's in 71. I don't know if anybody was there or remembers this. There was so much buzz. Lou was a master marketer. And there was so much excitement that day. A Cadillac crashed through the front brick wall of Lou's. So if you drive by the one on the original on Lincoln, as you're looking at the building, just to the right of the front door, a Cadillac crashed through the wall. Woman broke her arm, went to the hospital. Lou knew a guy in masonry. They patched up the wall. They opened up on day 2. But that day, his wife told him he was crazy for leaving Uno's and Due's. He should have stayed downtown. This serves you right. And he's like, no, trust me. And so he was right, because even though he sadly passed away also like 6 or 7 years later, the business was sold about a year or so ago for $600 million, or give or take. So they've done pretty well. There are about 60-ish Lou Malnati's now, most in Chicagoland. But in 71, so you got Lou's opening up on St. Patrick's Day. 5 months later, up on Loyola's campus on the North Shore, My Pie, which is one of my favorite deep dish places. Larry Aronson, still alive at 84 years old. Then there's Guy's, which is on the northwest side. which became Nancy's, and that they were doing stuffed pizza, which is a totally different style of pizza that has a second layer of dough across the top, and then the sauce going on top of that top layer of dough. And then, as I mentioned, in 76, the pizza puff was created because a lot of hot dog stands were getting crushed by the pizza business. So stuffed is born in 71. This is also interesting. So I mentioned 70 being kind of this kickoff of the second wave, but you have guys becoming Nancy's, and Rocco Palese, who was Italian immigrant, did not want to do what everybody else was doing. Everybody's doing deep dish. He's like, I want to do something different. And so he thinks about the pizza rustica, the Easter pie back in Italy, which was a pie. Think about a savory pie or a sweet pie stuffed with ingredients. It's salami, cheese, eggs, what have you in Italy. But in America, he's thinking, why don't we just do mozzarella and pepperoni or sausage or whatever, and then put a second layer of dough across the top, and then the sauce on top of that. So there is a complete segregation of sauce to toppings. And I have a hard time with, because one of the great things about pizza is when you're baking it, you're creating this flavorful sauce of tomato sauce with your toppings, right? It's all kind of cooking together. You don't get that with stuffed. You also have this second layer of dough across the top. Architecturally, I've got problems with that as well, because that dough sits between sauce above and cheese below. You can sort of see that in the picture here. And certainly it looks tempting as you're lifting a slice from this pie and you get this beautiful cheese pull. But if you think about that top layer of dough, it's almost like a wet cooked noodle in terms of texture. And you also have these very high sides, because it's unavoidable when you're putting a second layer of dough across. You need to have this high wall. So again, this is the one that's mocked on the East Coast. They call it the above ground outdoor pool. They call it the boat anchor. They call it the tomato soup in a bread bowl. I call it the Game of Thrones because it looks like a castle. So it's mocked frequently. I would argue that this is not the most popular style of pizza in Chicago. I would argue that this is not what locals typically eat. I would argue on and on until I'm blue in the face. I respect what they're doing, but I've got a problem with the OBR. Now, Giordano started 3 years later. Why is that? Again, I go into this story in great detail in my book. One of my colleagues at ABC7, who was a producer with me, retired to South Carolina, but I found her. She was a food critic for the Suburban Sun-Times in 70, 71. She remembers when Nancy's opened. She tells me this was a delicious pizza. It was very light. It was almost like a souffle, like a great slice of lasagna. And you wouldn't eat a whole sheet pan of lasagna, right? You'd have one slice of lasagna. Same principle here. You'd have one slice of stuffed. And she said that 2 employees who were working at Nancy's decided to leave. They said they were going to go back to Argentina. And for those of you who remember, Argentina has a lot of Italians who've emigrated there. And they said they were going to go back to Argentina and we're going to go cook with our nonna or our mother. And instead they went to Marquette Park and they opened a place called Giordano's. And the only way Nancy's heard about it was because the meat and cheese supplier that they were buying from told them, hey, FYI, we're also selling the same product to some guys on the South Side called Giordano's. So Giordano's will claim that they created it in 74. I tried to get them. I talked to the vice president company about it. That's what they say. We started it in 74, but you can read between the lines. They did not create it. It was created in 71 by Nancy's. The third wave, you see chefs shifting to pizza. There's this picture here in the middle is from a fantastic place called Pizza Friendly Pizza in Ukrainian Village. And the chef is a 2 Michelin star chef from Oriole Restaurant, very talented guy. During the pandemic, they were all shut down and they decided to reinvent a cafe that their company owned on Western Avenue. And he had sent me pictures of the undercarriage, which is the bottom of the pizza. As you look, I always look underneath my pizzas. I want to see usually 4 shades of brown and black. I don't want to see blonde, underdone, sort of wan looking. And so I told him, I said, I disagree. I'm not a fan of what pictures you're sending me. And I was kind of for those of you who know what a shidduch is, I was kind of the matchmaker between him and this famous guy in Las Vegas who's known for Sicilian. And they worked on this. And they came up with this great Sicilian pizza that's now available. Sicilian is not a style we have in spades in Chicago. And so you get these bakers bringing their expertise. You see consumers wanting options. On the right side here is a Roman al taglio, which means by the cut, a style that came from Rome about 60 years ago. And there's a company called the Pizzarium in Rome, and it's helmed by a gentleman named Gabriele Bonci. And Mr. Bonci was approached by this former CEO of P.F. Chang's in America. And he said, we want to create a company. We want to take your brand to America. And so they created an LLC called Bonci USA. And the very first place they opened up outside of Rome was in the West Loop on Sangamon. And so they do this really interesting style of pizza, and it's done in a rectangular pan, and it's fermented for about 3 days. So it builds a lot of character and flavor and crunch. And you can see just by looking at them, there's no red sauce. Well, there's some red sauce, but in this case, no red sauce. From right to left, the right one is a potato mozzarella. The one in the middle has nduja, which is a spicy, spreadable Calabrian sausage. And then on the far left side is lemon zest, black pepper, and fresh ricotta cheese. So very creative toppings. And then on the far left side here is just a classic thin pizza, not a Chicago thin, because that would be cut into squares, but just a classic thin from a great place called Crushed on Montrose that I really adore. And again, longer fermentation times. When someone says we make our dough fresh every day, that's okay, but I really want to hear, well, but when do you bake it? Because if you're making it fresh every day, I really want you to hold it in your refrigerator for 2 days at least, to let the yeast eat the sugars to create carbon dioxide, to get those beautiful open crumbs in the crust. So when you look at the side of the pizza, you see some open crumb structure that shows you there's some air, there's some hydration, there's some fermentation going on. That's what builds flavor and builds crunch and chew and character. So you're not biting into cardboard. So, and then these are the 10 styles, at least ones that I've identified. So here's tavern style, also known as Chicago thin, bar pie, the party cut, what have you, has lots of different names. Can anybody tell me where this pizza is from? Very good, Barnaby's. Good call. Yes, sir. That's the crimped edge there. That's the giveaway, right? And again, half sausage, half pepperoni for me every time I order, just so I can compare notes. Pepperoni is the most popular topping in America, except for Chicago, where it is sausage, which makes sense because of the Union Stockyards culture here. You know, hog butcher for the world, Carl Sandburg. He wasn't kidding. A lot of sausage consumed here. Here's deep dish. Left side is Lou Malnati's, right side is Lefty's up in Wilmette and Highland Park. Now you'll notice the outside of Lefty's is charred. That comes from the late Burt Katz from Pequod's and Burt's. He was known for placing a little bit of extra mozzarella along the interior wall of the pizza pan. And so that as it baked and the crust sort of pushed in a little bit as it bakes, the cheese would come down the sides. And I have no proof of this, but I'm convinced he got it from Detroit, because Detroit was doing it in 1946. And so Burt may have gone to Detroit at some point and seen that style, but Burt was the local pioneer in terms of that sort of caramelized at cheesy edge crust. And so what happened with Burt's was when he passed away, he sold the business to two gentlemen who were best friends until they opened the business together, and then they quickly split. And then one of those gentlemen opened up Lefty's on the North Shore. But you can see Lou's, it's not 18 miles high, right? It's got a high side, and it's got like a maybe an inch in the middle in terms of height. Here's stuffed. This is from Superosa on the northwest side. Again, lots of cheese in the middle, shredded cheese, by the way, not slices. You look at the Lou's and the Lefty's are both using slices of mozzarella for more even coverage. When you're throwing a handful of shredded mozzarella, you get, I think, overkill. And you just look at how much dough is on the outside, that rarely gets eaten. And so you see on the plates, you see lots of what we call dough bones or crust orphans, because you just don't want to eat all that dough, which doesn't have a lot of flavor. Here's Neapolitan. This is the original pizza style back to the 12th century in Naples, and noted for its sort of crispy, not really crispy, actually, chewy. It's a chewy crust. It's got leopard spotting on the outside from the high heat, always baked in a wood-fired oven or coal, but typically wood, 90-second bake. So if you've got ADD and you cannot wait for your pizza and you just have no patience, give me a Neapolitan because you only wait 90 seconds. The problem with this pizza is you cannot take it to go. It deteriorates rapidly, especially in a cardboard box in a car. So I would recommend if you're going to get a Neapolitan, just set out, you're going to go there, you're going to eat it there, or eat it on your tailgate like I do a lot of times. You cannot pick this pizza up with your hands. It's got to be knife and fork, unless you're going to fold the whole thing in half and then fold it a second time. It's very hard, doesn't travel well, but eaten fresh, 2 minutes out of the oven, delicious. To be Neapolitan, by the way, you've got to check lots of boxes. There's a certification that some people hang in their businesses called the VPN. It stands for Verace Pizza Napolitana. And there's only 4 VPN certified places in Chicagoland. All that means is that they are buying their fresh mozzarella from Italy. They're buying their San Marzano tomatoes from Italy. They're buying their 00 Caputo flour from Italy. You know, it's kind of a guarantee that you're buying Italian product. What it doesn't guarantee is that the person making the pizzas is trained. And so, of course, for that, there's a separate certification called the AVPN. And that means that the person making the pizzas has been certified. So it's like, I'd rather have that certification. By the way, that was from Spaccanapoli in Ravenswood. This is from Pizza Friendly Pizza. Again, the Sicilian place on Western Avenue I told you about. Sicilian baked in a rectangular pan. Dough is left to proof overnight to rise, and then topped and baked second day typically. You can sort of get there's lots of Italian bakeries that have this style. This is the sixth one. Bakery style slices. So Cecilia Bakery up on the Northwest side. There's one on Cumberland. There's one on Lawrence. This is from D'Amato's, which has been around since 1950 on Grand Avenue. Juicier, softer, more supple, not crispy. I typically will get a slice like this and I'll ask them to go back in the oven and bake it for 3 minutes because I want my undercarriage a little crispier. I want to have a little bit of a resistance. I don't want to have sort of a soft, like mealy flavor. Now, the owner of the bakery, when I showed her this picture that I took, asked her, is this okay if I put this in the book? And she looked at it kind of lovingly and she said, yeah, juicy. I like a juicy slice. I've never heard anybody describe a slice positively as juicy. But that's what in her mind, that's a positive. But they're typically, in a bakery sheet in the case next to the cookies and the cannolis, and you get one, you get it in a wax paper and you can take it to go. Detroit style, I mentioned 1946, started at Buddy's in Hamtramck, just outside of Detroit. More like a focaccia. You can see all that open crumb in the middle, and then a really crispy bottom and a crispy edge. The cheesy crispy edge is called a frico. So lots of terminology. I have a whole glossary in the book, undercarriage, OBR, frico. That's that crispy edge. This is from Paulie G's Logan Square, which is always on our Saturday bus tour. A little bit of fresh ricotta on top, pepperoni, of course, because it's Detroit, but served on a cooling rack. Again, remember I talked about home run in on the dimpled pan? It's to elevate it and circulate airflow underneath the pizza to keep it crispy. Roman, I mentioned the Roman al taglio on the far left. But there are 2 other types of Romans. In the middle there, that's a Roman tavern style, like Roman Tavern in Chicago. That's from Pizzeria Via Stato on State Street. Very thin and crispy. Again, you see the pan has holes in it to promote airflow underneath. And then Roman al Metro is the one that looks like a surfboard. That's from Bar Cargo on North Wells Street. Again, Anthony Stefani from the Stefani family went to Rome, fell in love with the style of pizza, came back to America, wanted to replicate it. So the dough is fermented at least 3 days, baked like it's a Roman al Metro. It's by the meter, which is why it's so long. And they typically will cut this up into slices, but you got to really go with a friend. But it's a very crispy, crunchy. The difference between the Romans and the Neapolitans like that soft, chewy, wet. The Romans like firm, crispy, crunchy. So I really like the Roman style. And then artisan, this just means a chef's approach to pizza. So they're really going to think like a baker. Long fermentation, lots of water in the dough, farmer's market toppings. They're making everything themselves. They're roasting the mushrooms in-house. Here's a good way to tell if a pizza place is serious about their toppings. When you get a mushroom pie, if you ever cook with mushrooms at home, or mushrooms, spinach, onions, when you cook in a saute pan, they release a lot of liquid, right? And so when you put those raw ingredients on a pizza and bake it for 15, 20 minutes, what's going to happen to the pizza? Get mushy, soggy, wet. And you're like, why is this pizza so wet? because they didn't pre-saute or roast those ingredients. And so like there's a place in New York that I went to called Upside. And I'm like, why is this mushroom pie so good? Because they spent all day sauteing mushrooms and then putting them in their refrigerated holder. And then as they're making pizzas, they're putting those roasted or sauteed mushrooms on the pizza. All the liquid's gone already. And then when it bakes, it's just infusing it with all that great earthy mushroom flavor. So you want places where, and I'm a crazy person. When I go to a pizza place and I want a mushroom pie, I'll ask the server, do they roast or saute the mushrooms ahead of time? Because I don't want a wet pie. This is from Middlebrow Bungalow in Logan Square. Look at that open crumb structure. That tells you, wow, that's going to be a delicious crust to eat on its own. I'm not going to leave that dough bone or that crust orphan on the plate. It's got a lot of flavor. It's got a lot of crunch. It's like eating baguette or ciabatta, right? It's got a lot of flavor on its own. And then New York style slice. A lot of New Yorkers move here and they lament, I cannot find New York slices anywhere. In Chicago, yes, you can. I've got a whole chapter on slices. This is from Jimmy's. On the left is from Jimmy's Pizza Cafe up on Montrose. And on the right is from Kraft in Wicker Park. Beautiful New York style, East Coast. You can fold it with your 3 fingers and eat it on the go. And then maybe 11 styles, right? Thin. I didn't talk about thin as much. This is from Crushed again on Montrose. Fermented for 2 days, lots of flavor, it holds its shape. And so when I pick up a slice of pizza like this, I want to be able to fold it and have it not flop. So there's no tip sag. I want to be able to hold it firmly and then eat it with one hand. So I say Chicago pizza is multiple styles of pizza. On the right here is a place, perfect pandemic story. It's a place called City's Edge Bar and Grill. It's up on Peterson. Is it Peterson or Devon? Might be Devon. Wasn't it Irish bar, had a smoker, they were doing barbecue, and then pandemic comes along and they start doing pizzas, and he's doing a Detroit style pizza. You can see the crispy caramelized frico on the edge. Sauce usually is placed on the top, room temperature, but this pizza is an Italian beef with the giardiniera. So that's a real Chicago approach to pizza. So I love the fact that we can be this creative in Chicago, right? We can have a Detroit style pizza that's influenced by Chicago availability of ingredients, having Italian beef and giardiniera. By the way, my favorite pizza is a sausage giardiniera pie, because that crispy, that sort of crunchy, briny, spicy giardiniera that I typically have on an Italian beef sandwich, but spread on a pizza and baked, gives it just this, I don't need any red pepper flakes at all. It's just, it has just enough heat and sweetness and brininess and crunchiness to go with that rich sausage on a pie. So I will happily take questions.
Steve, that was absolutely wonderful. Let's give him a big hand.
Thanks.
Well, we're going to take questions first from the auditorium.
Okay.
Is it on?
Yep.
That was wonderful. That was great. I took notes.
Thanks.
I live Winnetka. I want to go get a piece of pizza for lunch. Where do I go? I have taken Mariano's away from my selection. Fresh Market has slices. They're iffy. Where do I go for a slice of pizza around here?
There's not a good slice joint up here, but there's a great pizza place called Grateful Bites in Winnetka. Have you heard of Grateful Bites on Green Bay? Yeah, Grateful Bites is probably the best pizza in your neighborhood. But there's not a New York slice opportunity up here. That's up to you. I mean, I would get a sausage and giardiniera, or I'd get a pepperoni. Honestly, whatever pizza is the first one they list is going to be their house favorite, because that's the one they've thought about the most. And that's the one that they're going to be most proud of. They do an elote pizza with cilantro, lime, crema, and corn, which is delicious. But I'm a simple guy. I want 2 toppings. I want like sausage and something, or pepperoni and something, and that's it. I don't do supremes. I don't weigh a bunch of things on top of the pizza. I never do mushroom, onion, pepper. It's like less is more with pizza.
It sounds as though you eat pizza 3 times a day. If you're not eating pizza, what do you eat?
Korean food is actually my favorite thing to eat. If we're given a chance, what do you want to eat? Like last meal kind of stuff. It's Korean. I like, because I grew up without Korean and I fell in love with it in my 20s. And I like the variety. I like that there's a little bit of meat, not a ton. It's lots of vegetables. I'm actually going out to a place in, I think, Glenview or Northbrook this Thursday to check out a Korean place. Something gastropub, town, something gastropub. I think it's sorry.
Yeah, in Chicago on Clark Street in the 70s, there was a place called a Chicago Pizza and Oven Grinder. Never became a chain or anything. I wonder if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I get that question a lot because they've been around a long time. I don't consider it pizza. I consider it melted cheese in a bread bowl. It's kind of it's a little bit gimmicky. It's not really pizza. So no offense, they do a good job. They've been around a long time. I respect the building they're in from, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It's got a lot of Chicago history around it. But if I'm going to send somebody for pizza, I probably won't send them there. Yeah. Do I rate the sausage I use? No, I don't rate the sausage. I mean, a lot of it's going to be either Anachini or Fontanini in Chicago. But I will say that I've noticed a difference in terms of like a place like Aurelio's, which is all over the South Side. They serve these little pebbles, almost like blueberry size sausage. And I prefer more of a hand pinched and pressed with jagged edges that's going to bake a little bit more and get kind of juicy, crispy, crunchy. I want like textures to my sausage. But a lot of the sausage in Chicago is quite good. It has fennel and fat. It's hard to go wrong.
Yeah. How are New York City pizzas different than the pizzas we have here in Chicago? Their typical pizza. What's it like?
So New York is a real mobile pizza culture. You're typically having pizza to go. It's always sliced. You never get a whole pie. It's because there's so many individuals and you're walking to somewhere from somewhere. You're going to take a quick break, eat it on like an Italian beef. You're going to eat it standing up on a counter. Whereas in the Midwest, we have larger, messier pies. One of the reasons you don't see deep stuffed Detroit style on the East Coast is because it requires knife and fork. Oftentimes it's a little bit messier. You can't stand on a paper plate eating it. So New York style should always be thin. Typically they're 18 to 20 inch pies that are cut into 8 wedges and always served on a paper plate. You should be able to fold it with 3 fingers. You crack the heel with 1 finger and you fold it in half like in a V shape and you're able to eat that way. Typically pepperoni or cheese. The sausage on the East Coast is tricky because it was typically links that are par cooked, halfway cooked, cut into disc shapes that look like pepperoni, placed on the pie, but most of the fat has been rendered or cooked out of the sausage by then. And the difference between those and the Midwest is that we're putting on raw sausage and baking it until it's cooked through, but all that fat is rendering into the pie, imbuing it with this glorious, rich, sausagey, fatty flavor, which is what you don't get on the East Coast.
What do you have to say about Pequods?
Pequods does a great job. They're in the books I mentioned. One of my beefs with them is I feel like the OBR is a little bit out of whack. I feel like it's a little bit too much of bottom crust. It's always the top third I love, but it's the bottom 2/3 that I don't really want to eat always. And some people have told me, oh, no, you got to order a half dough. It's like, or you go to this place, you got to get it well done. Everybody knows you got to get it well done, half dough, half this, that. Like, I don't want to special order coffee my pizza. It should just be made the right way every time, I think. And so one of my issues is that I don't feel like they've got the ratio down. I love the caramelized edge to Pequods, but I think they get a little bit more press than they deserve sometimes. And there are places like Millie's Pizza in the Pan that does a better job, or George's in Edgewater that does a better job, but doesn't have any press.
Yeah, my first pizza was perhaps 70 years ago at Douai. Are they still in business there?
Yeah, so they were bought by the same Boston-based franchisor that had Uno's. And so Uno's, Douai's, and the Su Casa Mexican restaurant behind Douai's are owned by the same group out of Boston. And so they haven't changed much, with the exception that they par cook or half cook their dough to save time, because they don't want people to wait 45 minutes for a pizza. And so they'll par cook it to speed up the process a bit, which I'm not sure helps the pizza. But Douai's is in business, sure. Good. Yeah.
We discovered Bert's Place, which I guess is similar to the Pequods. What's your opinion? Their crust seems not as It seems better to me. than
Same
Pequod's.
recipe. I mean, Burt Katz sold Pequods, and they must not have been a non-compete or in the contract, because a couple of years later he opened up. He had Pequods. He sold Pequods to a dentist from the suburbs, and then opened up Burt's Place around the corner in Morton Grove. They're the same recipe. Yeah. The problem I have with Burt's 2.0 is that, when Burt was ill, and when he was talking about selling it, he wasn't, I think it's important to work side by side with the person you're selling to. And he was already in the hospital. And so the gentlemen who bought the business from Burt were bringing dough to him in the hospital, and he was touching it and going yay or nay. It's not the same as sort of working side by side. And I feel like there was a little bit of a drop off potentially in the handoff. When Burt was there and I went to see him, when he was firing on all cylinders, it was a great, great pizza. Because of the OBR. Again, it's deep, but it's not overwhelming, and everything's in proportion. I think that's important.
There's a place in Northbrook on Dundee Road called Chicago Pizza Company. Have you tried it, and what do you think?
There was a Chicago Pizza Company I had in the city. It must be the same thing. It was okay, but I don't think it made my top 101.
Yeah, what became of Bacino's? First question. And second, what do you think of all the varieties of California pizza that they have?
So Bacino's is still around, or the Bacino's restaurant closed. You're talking about what was on the Loop? Because there's a, I don't know what happened to them. And then the California pizzas are interesting. We're going to do a pizza festival in LA in March because there's so many different styles now. The thing about California pizza is just their availability of ingredients. The farmers markets there go year round, and there's a lot more wood-fired pizza on the West Coast. So they like to bake pizzas over open fire, in an open fire oven, which gives it a different sort of romance and texture, I think. But I like eating in California too. I think they have good pizza there.
Norton's in Highland Park. It's thin crust. It's small. It has the greatest taste. What do you think about that pizza?
I've not been to Norton's.
Okay.
We have one more question in the auditorium, and then we've got several questions from Zoom. Steve, we hope you have a few more minutes to spend with us.
Sure.
Okay, thank
I have
you.
a question. When I was younger, my first pizza I had, 71st in Alston, Mama Leone's, and it's long gone, I'm sure. But they used to make the pizza in the oven, and they flip the pizza dough up to something on the ceiling, and it would blast it off the ceiling, and then they'd roll it. It was kind of fun to watch. Any of that still go on, or what was the reason for it to begin with?
Why they're tossing it in the air, you mean?
You toss it in the air, and they had a thing up in the ceiling, would hit the ceiling, and then they'd come down, they'd catch it, and they'd
I've never, that's a crazy, I mean, I've seen people toss dough in the air, like on the East Coast. They want to, because they're stretching it out. They want to get as wide as they can.
This is what it was, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about hitting the ceiling, but yeah, you don't see that a lot in Chicago. Again, just because of the tavern culture here, they're pushing the dough through a dough sheeter, which are the opposing rollers to thin the dough out.
As you can see from my age, it's a long time ago.
It was, yeah. I mean, the ovens were different there, but yeah, you don't see a lot of that. But I mean, that's really more of an East Coast, stretching the dough wide like that.
Right. Thank you, Steve. Your book is going to be amazing. I mean, we've picked up even today dough bones, crust orphans, tip sag. I mean, you've added to our, and you have to have some Italian in your genetic background. But one of the questions is from Karen from Zoom. I'm allergic to tomatoes, peppers, and mushrooms, and I keep kosher. So where's the best alternate sauce? Pesto Alfredo? No meat pizza? And is there such a thing commercially available? So serious question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Does she, I mean, she could do a white pie. You wouldn't need, red sauce. You could certainly do a white pie with vegetable. You could always ask, a lot of these places are happy to make accommodations. They offer gluten-free. A lot of times I'm seeing more of, I'm seeing a couple places doing vegan cheese. If you're dairy, you can't do dairy. So I would just ask or call the pizzeria before you go and just ask them, can you accommodate gluten-free or vegan? But she could certainly do a white pie with no sauce.
Okay. Along that lines, let me find it here. Does fruit dessert pizza interest you or exist, or what are your thoughts? When you mentioned soggy, I think
Yeah,
that's going to be the answer,
That's
right?
the problem. And, people, I know pineapple is like a dividing line for people, but I've been to places where they roast pineapple ahead of time, draws a lot of the moisture out. You still have the intense sweetness of pineapple. And it's a nice balance if you've got something like spicy soppressata or something spicy on the pie to balance the heat. But I typically would not have fruit on a pizza. I'm also not like a fruit pierogi guy. I like savory. So I don't want to have like the fruit and cream cheese and things on a savory option. And I think dessert pizza is like, it's a fun gimmick for kids, but it's not something that I take very seriously.
Okay. Alan is asking, or basically mentioning, he usually the only frozen pizza we buy, wait, I'm missing a word here. Usually the only frozen pizza we buy, but lately trying Connie's. Never been to the mothership. Is there any particular frozen pizza you think that might be top of the list?
Yeah, well, I've not had Connie's actually. I do like Connie's though. They're in the book as well. But I mentioned Home Run Inn earlier, and they do a nice job with the thin pizzas, I think.
Okay. Some comments. Maureen is saying loved Eduardo's. What happened to Eduardo's? They were at Dundee and Milwaukee for years and years, grew their own fresh basil, make great deep dish.
Yeah, well, they were doing stuffed, not deep dish. Second layer of dough across the top. So they have one in Oak Park on North Avenue still. And I believe there was one in Printers Row on Dearborn, just south of Congress. And so those are independently owned, I think, as franchisees. And so certainly one on Dundee decides to close, doesn't force the other ones to close if they're busy enough.
Okay.
But that's a stuffed pie, not a deep dish.
Another comment, Maureen is telling us Stormy's has slices to go. So that comment on that. A couple more. Let me find them.
Steve, what do you think of cauliflower crust these days?
Yeah, that's big on the West Coast. Cauliflower crust is for people, gluten-free. Certainly, if you want to do that, I get it. I'd rather have a gluten-free crust though, made with just an alternate flour. There's a great place downtown called Robert's Pizza and Dough Company. He's making his own gluten-free dough, and there's a big difference. Like places like Lou's or Pat's will buy the dough from a company, frozen. But big difference when they're making it in-house and it's never frozen. And but cauliflower, I get it. I mean, I've seen it on the West Coast. It'll probably migrate here eventually. Very few cases of it, but I would look out for it. Yeah, it's an alternative for gluten-free.
Do you ever make pizza, Steve?
I do. I've got a recipe in the book.
And can you give us a tip off of what cheese and what sauce do you use?
Yeah, I use Stanislaus tomatoes. They come in 6-pound cans. I buy them on Amazon. I usually get three pizzas out of a can because they're plum tomatoes that I hand crush. And I make a pan pizza. I don't like to make thin pizzas at home because my oven only gets to 500, and I don't like launching it onto a pizza stone in my oven because it's too small. I make a pan pizza that I can kind of be more reliable with. And cheese, there's lots of great cheese out there. There's Grande, there's Belgioso. Really any good fresh mozzarella or part skim mozzarella is going to be fine. But it really depends what kind of pizza you're making. And I think it's easier for us at home to make a pan pizza. We can let the dough sit in the pan that you've greased with Crisco or something. Let it sit in the pan overnight in the fridge, and then let it come to room temperature over 4 or 5 hours in your kitchen, and gently press it to the edges. And then what I'll do is I'll bake it naked, par bake it at like 500 degrees for 10 minutes just to set it. And then if I want, I'll wrap it in plastic and put it in my freezer. And then when I want to make a pizza, I can pull it out that day, let it come to room temp, and then top it and bake it.
Terrific. And again, your book is here for those that want.
I'll sign them.
And the book is available online, I'm sure.
On Amazon.
Last question. What's your next saga, Steve? Best appetizer, best Best dessert? Do you dare do best cocktail?
That's a good question. I have given it some thought, but I honestly am so buried right now with pizza stuff, like the tours and the podcast and the pizza festivals, that I may not have time to do another book. I'm working on a children's book though, with pizza as the theme. It's called No Pizza for Priya. And Northwestern University Press has greenlit that. So we're going to do a children's book with the pizza theme as well.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, there's one more.
Oh, describe a pizza tour. Sure. So we do 3 walking tours and 1 bus tour every weekend. The bus tour is kind of our signature, 4 pizzerias on each tour. So we'd start at 11 o'clock downtown and do deep pan pizza, kind of like what a Pequod's is. And then we go get Detroit style in Logan Square. And then we go get tavern style thin in Lincoln Park. And then we end with an artisan pie in Streeterville. We also do a Bucktown walk. That's our longest walk. We do a short walk in the West Loop every Saturday, maybe under a mile. 4 pizzerias. And then we have an abbreviated tour Friday nights, 5 o'clock to 7:30. We do 3 stops downtown. Not that long of a walk.
What's your website?
Oh, pizzacityusa.com. pizzacityusa.com.
All right. Thank you so much.